Good evening and welcome everyone to this evening's Webinar Wednesday, Let's Talk Men and Mental Health. My name is Cassie Chambers. I'm the Operations Director at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. And tonight I have hosting this amazing panelist on this very important topic, especially as we kick off July being Mental Health Awareness Month. I'm very honored to be your host and to explore the unique challenges and opportunities and actions that we can take to support mental well-being for men across our country. Today, we are joined by an incredible panel of experts and change makers. So please let me acknowledge our distinguished guests. We have Marion Sher, a celebrated author whose work has given us a voice to men's experience in powerful ways, and with 30 years of experience of advocating, raising awareness on mental health, journalism, and media training. We also have Nkini Pasha, a respected SADAG board member, bringing invaluable insight from decades of mental health advocacy work, as well as Malcolm Brown, the CEO of Sun Pharma, who understands the importance of driving mental health awareness and resources at leadership level and helps to support us this evening. In South Africa, we know that men face enormous pressure to be strong, to provide, to never show weakness. And these expectations can become barriers that prevent them from reaching out for help. Too many men struggle in silence, too many feel alone, and far too many believe that seeking help and support is a sign of failure rather than strength. Statistics are a sobering story, and men in South Africa are at a high risk for substance abuse, violence, and 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women, all linked to mental health challenges that often go unspoken. But we are also seeing more and more men and communities breaking silence and challenging the stigma and changing the narrative around what it means to be healthy and resilient. That is why this discussion matters. We need to keep amplifying real, practical solutions, from open conversations just like this to creating safe spaces in sports clubs, around the meeting table and even the dinner table, as well as schools and within families, to make professional support more accessible and less intimidating. Today is just about that. It's about asking those tough questions, building new stories for men's mental health in South Africa, a story where no one feels ashamed to say, I need help, and no one is left to suffer alone. This evening, we have our amazing guests, and I think as we get the discussion going, I'd like to just welcome our guests online this evening, and I'm just going to add them as a spotlight. And I think first and foremost, Malcolm, I'd just love to hand over to you as our welcoming, as our sponsor, as a big supporter for mental health, just your opening address on why men and mental health in South Africa is so important. Over to you.
Yeah, good evening, Cassie. Good evening, Marion and Nkini. Great to join you guys on the webinar, and to all of those that have joined it. I think, depression and anxiety is such a topical concern from a global perspective, and the WHO have listed it as a global public crisis. And it is so important from the point of view of following on from COVID. We saw a 25% increase in depression and anxiety, and you throw on top of that South Africa and the environment which we live in, high unemployment rate, certainly high elements of crime. And it really makes for a tough environment in terms of where we stay. And there is hope for men. And I think for so many years, men have, guarded themselves and being brave instead of, discussing the topics and realizing that there is help out there. I mean, there's over 970 million people globally that suffer from mental health. And I mean, it's a massive number where there could be help for those people. And never mind the psychological stress that it puts on individuals, but also the amount of time that it takes out of productivity. I mean, WHO claims 1 trillion rand is lost annually. Sorry, $1 trillion. And that's a significant amount of money. But at the end of the day, it comes back to mental health and, the ability to be able to deal with it. So Sun Pharma is incredibly proud to be, the sponsor of Marion and her book. I mean, Sun Pharma started out in the healthcare space, specifically in mental health. So it's a very important topic to the company, and certainly a very important topic to myself. So I thank you for the opportunity and look forward to the chat.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. And I think also with 25 years plus experience in the workplace, I think you can really add value on what that resilience and that leadership looks like for so many men in the business sector. So we'll definitely be coming to those questions as well. And I just welcome everyone this evening to also please feel free to post any of your questions in the chat box. We will be having Q&A, and this is really a discussion. I now want to invite SADAG board member Nkini Pasha, who I've had the pleasure of working with for many, many years, and is a huge advocate for mental health, and especially around men and mental health. And I'd like to maybe start tonight's conversation to you and ask the question on why do men in South Africa still not feel comfortable enough to talk about mental health issues?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Cassie. Good evening to my co-panelists, Malcolm and Marion, and to everyone who's made time to join us this evening. I think this is quite a pertinent, conversation to have, and I think one that we certainly, cannot have enough of. I think, to your question, Cassie, we still have got a long way to go in South Africa when it comes to men and mental health. And, Malcolm has painted this global picture of the impact of mental health, I think generally, but also then when we narrow it down to men and we bring it closer to home. In South Africa, we are seeing a third of our population, will suffer from a type of a mental health condition at some point in their lifetime. If you look at how that translates into men, those statistics, show or rather count females much more than men, because men, we just do not present. However, when you look at the suicide rates, in South Africa, about 80% of suicides in South Africa are recorded for men. So really it's quite a huge impact that, mental health has on men. We don't come forward to seek, treatment. So therefore we are living and trying to cope and self-medicate with our mental health condition, and with, of course, leading to suicide, which is a, severe consequence of untreated, mental health. And I think what really holds us back, Casey, is how we are socialized as men. We've got this masculinity gold standard that we want to really live up to. We want to present a certain way in society in terms of the expectations of society of what it means to be a man and how to be as a man. So that really, limits us as men to come forward to seek help for our mental health condition. We look to other means to try and cope and, self-medicate, which unfortunately, as we've seen in the statistics, relating to suicide rates, that is actually proving not to be effective interventions when it comes to mental health conditions.
And that you brought up such an important part of what we want to really unpack tonight is around this toxic masculinity. And I'm going to bring in Marion Sher, the author, now, because I know she's interviewed a lot of different men around those themes of toxic masculinity. And it's a term that we have often seen in the press and media, and people are using it. But how does this show up in everyday life, especially in South Africa?
Well, to back up what Nkini said, I think what's very interesting about those statistics, with so many more men taking their own lives, is another statistic that's fascinating, which is that only 10% of the people that psychiatrists and psychologists see are men. 90% are women. So if you're not going there to get help, that says a lot. I think in researching this book, which was really hard to get men to open up to me, it went back every time to that thing. Well, when I was a kid, I was always taught, men don't show emotions, hold it in. Cowboys don't cry. And if someone at school gives you a hard time, you give them a hard time back. So if you grow up with that as your guideline, it's very difficult. And I love what Nkini said about the gold standard, you know, for men in this country. Interestingly, I've spent quite a lot of time in the United States, especially as a fellow of the Carter Center, Mrs. Carter's program for mental health journalism. And when I said then that I was going to do a part of my work for the fellowship on men and mental health, I turned around in that first meeting and said, well, men in South Africa don't suffer from mental health. And all these people, all these professors and scientists, their heads shut up. They said, what do you mean? So of course I said to them, well, they think they don't. And, you know, that sums it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think here I'd really also love to bring in Nkini into this conversation, because I think that also talks around, again, the South African man and how this toxic masculinity and what that looks like. And I think especially how culture has shaped us. So Nkini, in your perspective, how does South African culture kind of foster this toxic masculinity that we're seeing?
No, I mean, certainly, you know, there's gold, you know, masculinity gold standard, you know, that says tigers don't cry, you know, and, you know, I mean, even in, you know, in other languages, so bringing in culture and obviously those traditional beliefs, that as a man, you do not show emotions. As a man, it really is frowned upon, you know, to cry in public, even to explicitly say, you know what, I'm really battling, you know, with the psychological or emotional distress. We are as indoda, you know, indoda must, indoda, you know, and munna olela ting, you know, in sepedi. So, you know, these are just really some of the phrases that are used that fuel you know, this really masculine gold standard that is sort of, you know, pushed down on men. How, as a boy child, you are socialized from an early age. You know, it's okay for a girl to, you know, cry openly. It doesn't matter where they are, you know, and really to show that that emotional and you know, distress. But as a man, you can't. You are seen as being a sissy, you know, so it comes then with all these terms, and you know, that really goes to you know, to almost emasculate you as a man, to almost, you know, minimize you, you know, as a man, to say, you know what, if you are showing any signs of emotional distress, you are a sissy, you are a weakling. So this further fuels, you know, the stigma and the discrimination and really the fear as a man that I don't want to be judged. And therefore, if I'm experiencing, you know, this emotional and psychological distress, let me rather bottle it in and really seek to other means, you know, and those means, as, you know, we have seen, alcohol, for example, you know, quite a big one. You know, you tend to the bottle because you want to just, you know, cope and numb the pain, self-medicating, recreational drugs. And of course, all of these are easily accessible in our society. You know, and on a daily, this is then what you then turn to as a man to just really cope with what you are experiencing. But of course, that leads to other challenges as well, or other issues, you know, risky type behavior, you know, that then you would engage in, you know, so that really makes, you know, the problem even, you know, much more deeper. You know, endorphin dependent behavior that we talk about, that, you know, as a man, you know, I'm like, okay, I'm going to spend my time in the gym pumping that iron, because then what happens when I do so is that my body starts to release what we call endorphins, which are almost, you know, stress happy type, you know, chemicals, and then you get hooked on that, you know, and so really becoming a workaholic even, and that really camouflages, you know, the problem. And we have, of course, heard from, you know, other family members that say, well, we are shocked that, you know, this person has taken away their lives because they seemed like they had it all together, you know, but in fact, they were really, really struggling in silence.
And I think this is why I want to pose the next question to you, Marion. So you have written a new book. I know it's one of 3 in your mental health trilogy, although you've written many, many books around other topics, but this being your 3rd one on the back of Surfacing and Big Bully, this book now on men and mental health. Why did you write this book on men now? Oh, sorry, Marion, you're on mute.
Okay, no.
There we go. Yes,
Fine.
no, we can hear you. Yes.
I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, I think it's a good question. Why now? I think because it is becoming more acceptable, and the two other books I did, more and more men started coming forward, slowly, admittedly, but also an area which I focused on in the book is sports people, sportsmen. And I've been lucky enough over my career in journalism to interview quite a few sportsmen, specifically Springbok rugby players. And also what's important to remember with sports people, sportsmen, especially Springboks, there is so much riding on their shoulders every time they run out on that field. You can never, take it for granted, or they're the world champions, they're always going to win. And in South Africa, I know for a fact, unfortunately, Swayze can't be with us tonight because he's actually in a Springbok team meeting, that if these rugby players show any sign of weakness, then not only will they have a problem, they won't even get to sit on the bench, let alone walk out onto that field. So they keep it all inside. And in England, after one of the major players took their own life, then the English team sat up and took notice. And now they're very aware and they're doing a lot of work towards it. Some of the smaller teams here, when I say smaller teams, some of the provincial teams, certainly some of the school teams are looking at this as a very big issue. Another a very well-known sports person is Chad le Clos that I use in the book. Chad told me that one night he was in his hotel room in Germany. He trains in Germany. And he was this close to taking his own life. And he thought of his family, and he's got a very strong family tie. He's got an amazing family. And he phoned his dad, and he talked him down and flew him straight back to England, to South Africa from Germany, and gave him the help he wanted. And that's another interesting point. The minute all the people I've interviewed in all my stories, the minute they get help, their life changes. Unfortunately, the ones that don't get help go on to take their own lives.
And this is why these conversations are so important, is to highlight them, and that these are real stories and real cases. And I think what's really significant in the ones that you're talking about as well is around that these are the men, right, in big sports, in the top of their class, high achievement. And I think they were even struggling, which is really important to highlight. And you've interviewed quite a few of these kind of high profile men who share their stories in your new book. And maybe you can share from sports stars to comedians. Did you see any themes with a lot of the men that you spoke to, from high profile to those on the average man on the street, on what their depression or their mental health struggles were like?
Yes, I think Nkini highlighted one of the issues, that when a man feels that stress, and of course, in the workplace alone, today, we know that jobs don't come easy today. So, people all want to hang on to their jobs. And again, a theme that did come out in the workplace is, it's all very well having an HR department, but they're so scared to go and report or to say, I'm going to have a day off because I'm depressed. I'm going to have a day off because I've got the flu, I've broken my arm. Any of those things are fine. But God forbid they should say they're having a mental health issue. They see that as a blot on their career. And it's a really big issue. And I think with comedians, you mentioned comedians, and I interviewed the wonderful Eugene Khoza, who's a Black comedian, and David Kramer, who of course is a nationally known figure. And, I think with entertainers, what people don't realize, and I think it's with any celebrity anywhere in the world, you're up there, you're the flavor of the month, but you're only as good as your last movie, you're only as good as your last performance. And they live with that fear of tomorrow, maybe nobody wants to recognize me, maybe I'll be a failure. So all those issues, if you're not famous, it doesn't matter. But when you're up at that top level, to stay up at that top level, all these things, someone that's just employed, I did, as you say, speak to the ordinary man in the street. And again, it's the pressures of life. I've got a partner and children to look after. I've got parents I've got to look after. All those are pressures. And it doesn't mean to say that you've always got to go on antidepressants. Just simply having therapy, having someone to talk to, even a good friend, that makes the world a difference.
And Malcolm, I want to then also bring you into the conversation, because I think as a company to support mental health, what way you get behind the book, especially on something like men and mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Thanks very much. I think it's so important just in terms of, in the pharmaceutical arena at the moment, with the generic companies obviously coming into the forefront, the cost of antidepressants and access has obviously become so much easier. And in some instances, it's obviously a key element in the treatment. I think some of the biggest challenges we do have when it comes to patients who do start on antidepressants is specifically in men as well, is there's obviously there's the image to it as well, where some of them don't want to, and then a lot of them just stop their treatment before they should. And obviously the relapses of that is catastrophic, and you get into relapses. So I think what's critically important as pharma companies is for us not to only educate doctors, but healthcare workers who are actually the ones that are counseling these patients, to ensure that they understand the consequences, the ways of obviously being able to get help, but more importantly, the treatment regimes. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if you've sought help and you've been on treatment for 3 or 4 months and all of a sudden you feel fine, that you can, go cold turkey. I mean, that's possibly the worst, the possible thing that one can actually do. And I mean, it really is such a relevant topic in terms of the treatment. And I mean, I'll put it out there as well. I mean, from a personal perspective, obviously the worst part of depression is obviously suicide. And I mean, I was 14 years old when my father committed suicide. So dealing with the disease, so to speak, in terms of the consequences of it. I mean, it's incredibly tough to be a person who's left behind when you have got a loved one. And it was interesting, as a youngster, you try and justify it to yourself. And the way I used to do it is, that he had a brain attack. And, I think it's perfectly acceptable for a person to say that they had an MI. And that was some of the ways as a youngster that you do kind of justify it in your mind. So, to reach out to a person who is struggling is critically important, because they often don't know what they're doing, and they'll never understand the consequences of their actions to families. So critically important to make people aware and ensure that people are getting help.
And thank you as well, Malcolm, just for sharing that. I think it also shows how touched we are by mental health, and especially by men in our worlds, in our spaces, and being brave enough to share that. I think I really recognize that vulnerability, and I hope that it encourages more people to just share and talk about it and bring it into light, which 20, 30 years ago was something that we didn't speak about because of the stigma. It was always the things that were kept behind closed doors that families didn't talk about. And I know, Nkini, this is something that we've often spoken about with regards to the stigma that we as families have, especially around things like men and depression or suicide. And I have a question as well in the chat box that I would love to pose. And this again talks really uniquely to the South African context that we have, where we have a lot of people in really rural, outlandish areas who are dealing with the same struggles that someone in a built-up city would, but they don't have necessarily access to resources. So I just wanted to mention this comment in the chat box and see how we can perhaps discuss it. As a man raised in Rustenburg, rural setup and culturally traditional environment where expressing emotions is often seen as a weakness, which is what we've also spoken about.
Yeah.
How can I begin to unlearn that mindset and safely embrace my feelings without losing the respect of my community or sense of identity? And I think with that comment as well, it's really, acknowledging that unlearning, how do we become part of the change that we want to see, but also embracing, but not losing respect, which I think is such a key theme when we're talking about vulnerability and feelings. I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that is really, captured it's so well put in terms of that is the situation on the ground. That is what is happening, in our communities. And as you say, Casey, whether you're in the deep rural area or you're in the big city, because we carry those cultural beliefs, we carry those, lessons that, have been taught to us from an early age. But really, education is very key. Education, knowledge, as they say, is power. So really, first and foremost, understanding that, one, as a man, I am also just as, a human being as a woman is. It starts there. So as a man, as a human being, I also have got emotions, I've got feelings, and really validate, and that which you experience as a man, that which you feel as a man, and that mental health, like you would have diabetes. I think Marion mentioned earlier that when she was interviewing, different individuals for her book, men have indicated that it's easier to say in the workplace, well, I've got flu and therefore I'm not going to come into work, than to even make any insinuation about what is going on up here or or within your emotionally. So really understanding that if you've got diabetes, you've got any other medical, asthma, for example, hypertension, all these are medical conditions. And mental health conditions are also medical conditions that they do not discriminate. They don't say, oh yeah, well, you as a man, therefore I'm not going to, you can't get, a mental health condition. They do not discriminate based on gender. So really understanding that, as a man, you can also experience this, and that it is important that when you do, that you reach out and you get help. And through understanding what mental health conditions are, that there are medical conditions, that will start reshaping or at least having a paradigm shift, in terms of, how you were socialized as a young man, and how you view life, in terms of really just broadening your horizon and understanding that this is what the real issue is. So with that knowledge really, really comes, that power and that freedom, I would put it, to just break away from some of those, cultural beliefs, which oftentimes is actually myths, as we have seen. So really to try and break away from that and to try and do what is best, for self. But this also, Casey, it's not only to men. I think, earlier on I mentioned a line, and it was a big, social media, tagline that, indoda must. So also I think, be it feminists or be it, female partners as well, to just be cognizant of these kind of pressures as well, that we exert on men. I think the dynamics have changed, in society. Men, we've seen, previously it was mostly men that were really, working and providing for families, but those dynamics have changed. That in some families, you find that, a man has got a spouse who's obviously female and who's perhaps, better advanced, in the work area and really bringing the bacon home, And so I think it really takes, all of us to really be conscious about, some of these sayings or phrases that we use, the impact that then has on, the mental and, and emotional well-being of men, and how that can actually translate into a much more severe consequence, in your male partner or in your son, or your uncle, and so it goes.
Mm. And that's also really important because this evening we have a mixed audience, from men themselves to brothers and friends who have someone close to them, but we also have wives and mothers and sisters and girlfriends who are joining. And Marion, I know from the book and having to interview and speak to so many different experts, as someone who is understanding and really looking to be more empowered, how do we spot the signs for depression, especially in men? What does it look like?
Yeah, in fact, the week the book was coming out, I was back in Johannesburg and I spoke to somebody I knew and she said, I'm so excited your book's coming out. I can't wait to get it and give it to my husband. And I've known her for many, many years. And I looked at, what do you mean? And he seemed to me the most placid guy in the world. I know they've got a good marriage and they've got 2 teenage kids. I thought everything was rosy. And she said, he's depressed, he's anxious, and he won't do anything about it. And how it comes out, you ask me, how can wives see it? She said he's permanently angry and frustrated. And as Nkini said, the way they treat that very often is drinking or taking over-the-counter medications. And I think anger and frustration are 2 of the biggest things. I think a wife, you know, when you've been with someone a long time, you can pick these things up. But you saying to your husband, I think you should see someone, is overall you saying it. But if they don't have that commitment to want to do that, and again, if they can get over that hill of it's not embarrassing, it's not being seen that I'm weak. I mean, the minute they would think something's wrong with their heart or their kidneys or whatever it is, asthma, as Nkini mentioned, you go straight to a doctor. And unfortunately for mental health issues, it's not the same. All a wife, I would say, really can do is encourage them, not sort of be critical, you know, perhaps send them information, you know, show them what's online. SADAG has so much information on their website. And I also want to say, I owe a huge thank you to Malcolm and all the guys, Marla Rampishat and all the staff at Sunfarm who've been so amazing and so incredibly supportive to me. And, you know, this is interesting because farmers get a bad rap, pharmaceutical companies. But here's a pharmaceutical company that has put its money where its mouth is. And I think, Malcolm, it's very brave of you. I didn't know the story about your father. I'm very sorry to hear that. But what we find is someone like Malcolm does understand. You see, in the minute somebody understands, you know, they're prepared to get involved and do something about it. So all we can do is educate. And people say to me, why did you write the book? I write these books to start conversations. And that's what we're doing right now.
Exactly. And I think more of these conversations are needed to unpack all the nuances and the details, because I think it's that safe space where we get to explore and understand and really come together. And Malcolm, you know, from your experience and supporting the book and having these conversations and working in this space for so long, do you feel that men are beginning to take their own mental health more seriously?
To a certain degree, they are, but I think that there's still a massive gap. And like Marion and Nkini have alluded to, you know, education is so important. But I think we also have a responsibility, you know, as friends, as colleagues, when we see somebody's having a tough time to, you know, don't assume that it's just a bad day or assume that, you know, there's an environment at home where somebody will look after them. Have the conversation, you know, rather have somebody brush you off or be angry, but ask the questions. And I think it's so important in a corporate organization as well to create that psychological safety for, you know, staff to come forward and have that discussion. You know, I think it's a travesty that if somebody is off ill, you know, we would always, you know, send good messages of well wishes, etc., but that people feel, you know, the need to mislead or lie, you know, when it comes to mental health. It really shouldn't be that case. And employers should really focus on the people. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, the environment which they work in and create, it's critical that we look after our people. And yeah, I mean, it really boils down to whether it's family, whether it's employees, that if we have a suspicion that a person is going through a hard time, it should be our duty to approach them and see that we could assist them in one way or another.
Thank you. And I think, again, you mentioned such an important term around psychological safety for both men and women in the workplaces, because we spend so much time there and starting those narratives as a collective. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's an important theme. And I think it also begs to what treatment should look like. And Nkini, I want to bounce this question. We've had a chat or a comment in our Facebook Live talking about what treatment looks like for men. We know that often when men are feeling down or heavy or what we would classify as depression, but perhaps they're feeling low mood, low energy, backaches, and they're going to their GP, it almost seems like it's too quick to diagnose, or that men are often looking for a quick fix, a quick tablet that will fix them, when actually we're having to look at this holistic approach that also includes therapy and counseling. What does treatment look like? And what should we do to change the narrative around the quick fix?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Casey, let me start here. I just also want to commend, Malcolm, and really commend, Sun Pharma. Certainly a lot of corporates have got, a lot to learn, in this instance, because it's important that within our corporates, I mean, earlier on, Marion mentioned about, rugby, that's the workplace. Now, many of us, we go into these corporates, spend hours there. We spend more time at work, in fact, than we spend, in our houses. And what we have seen is that oftentimes there is no safe space, within our corporates, because the leaders within, these corporates are really not sensitive enough or even understand mental health conditions. So I mean, we did a survey a couple of years ago, Casey, you would remember, looking at mental health within the workplace. And I mean, the results were actually quite astonishing. A huge number of respondents to the survey said they don't feel confident enough or comfortable to actually explicitly say to their line manager that I am actually suffering from depression or a type of an anxiety disorder and so forth. So really it means that, within the workforce, we are all suffering in silence. We are fearful that if I disclose my mental health condition, I'm not going to get that raise, I'm not going to get that promotion. And so literally it limits, my advancement within that organization. So I think it's hugely commendable, for organizations such as Sun Pharma, for leaders such as Malcolm, to actually come forward and say, enough is enough. We have to take a stand. We have to ensure that our workplaces, are safe spaces for mental health conditions. And I think also us as friends, as family members, and as colleagues, we also need to, keep each other in check, because oftentimes, you've heard, this one is crazy. This one is that, And we allow these kind of phrases to be used, and, it's jokingly and all of that. I think it is high time that we also, teach one another and really call each other out to say, that is not something that we actually joke about, because potentially you could be sitting with a colleague that is actually going through or suffering from a type of a mental health condition. So all of us to be really cognizant and conscious about that on a daily basis. But coming back to treatment, I think, treatment is hugely important. As I said, mental health conditions are medical conditions, just like any other. If you are diabetic, you are type 1 diabetic, you need your insulin, to allow your body to be able to break down that sugar, right? So therefore, even with mental health conditions, it is important to get help, to get medical expert, management of your condition. One, depending as well how severe your condition is, because unfortunately with mental health conditions, the longer it takes that is not treated, it gets worse. So it is advisable to say, the quicker you get treatment, the better the outcomes. So in treatment, we talk about medical treatment, so where you get your antidepressant or anxiolytics that are prescribed to you. It is also important, and I think Malcolm spoke about this, that you stick to your treatment plan. When you are put on treatment, to say, like you would get antibiotics, they will say complete the course. It is important as well. And I mean, we would say, well, a minimum of 6 months, but also this is dependent on how severe your condition is. But it's important to stick to your treatment regime, to your treatment plan as prescribed to you, either by your general practitioner or your psychiatrist. But also, counseling, Marion did mention this as well. It is important to really go for counseling, to have that outlet, be it, through, us as the South Africa Depression and Anxiety Group, we've got trained counselors, we offer telephonic counseling, we can refer to, experts, in different specialties within, obviously, CNS. So it is important to also have that, see your psychologist, and, get that, psychotherapy. It is important. And I think as well, Casey, we live in a very violent society. Every single day, all of us, we are one way or the other affected by what happens in our society. We consume all these, terrible stories, but also we experience, because, most of us have been victims, of these violent crimes. Now, there's no doubt that that will result in some level of trauma. It will result in some level of what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a type of an anxiety disorder. So going for counseling and really, getting that help to get through that purge, it is important. So for men, I think it is important to say, minimize, those drinks, seek proper medical attention, stick to your treatment, look at what you are consuming, eat well, prioritize getting enough sleep, and of course, waking out is important. So exercise, whether you jog, whether you take a walk around the block, all of these are all, interventions that go a long way in ensuring that, your mental health, it is prioritized and it is where it's supposed to be.
Absolutely. And I love that whole holistic care, where it could be the medical treatment and owning that, going for the therapy and the talk, but also that self-care, the day-to-day that we have to do to look after our mental health. Because while not all of us have a mental illness, we all have mental health, and we should be doing something every day to look after our mental health and well-being. And there was a very important quote and comment in the chat box that I was trying to pull on now around, talking about it and speaking out and bringing light to these conversations. So I just want to also commend our audience online who are really engaging and sharing. And I think, Marion, I know that in your book and through all your interviews that you've done over the years, and we had a question in the chat box that I wanted to address to you is, why do we think that so many men are afraid to ask for professional help, especially professional psychological help? Seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist is still seen as so taboo. And you've interviewed such amazing case studies who've shared those insights. And how difficult, and why do you think it's so difficult for men to take that step for professional help?
Yeah, I think it's that walking in that door. And it's not just men, generally women as well, taking that very first step. I know one big corporate in this country that I was doing some work with, they said, no, we're going to offer our staff psychiatric, more therapy help, not so much psychiatric. And they set up an office with a psychologist and counselor there to help them. Did anyone go there and knock on that door and walk in? Not just men. Nobody wanted to be seen going in there. It's the same thing. It's just, again, it comes back to education, Cassie, that it isn't any different. Having a mental health illness, the word illness, it's an illness. And I think when I first started writing on mental health, I knew nothing about mental health. And Zane Wilson, who started SADAG, she got me on the road to this and she's sending me press releases about schizophrenia, bipolar, because we're just talking about depression, but of course there's so many layers. And Malcolm mentioned about staying on medication, for instance, bipolar disorder, which is a serious illness. And there is medication and you can live a normal life. But what happens with that, for instance, talking about education, people with bipolar disorder, the minute you take this medication and you feel fantastic, so you think, I feel fantastic, I'll come off it. What they don't realize is when you come off it, you know, you go right back down again. And even if you then go back on it again, you'll never reach that level. You just keep going down and down. Now, I'm bringing that up because it's education. It's understanding. People don't know what bipolar is. They don't know what schizophrenia is. We really don't know much. We close our ears when we hear mental health. And the one thing I discovered was the difference between more than just a bad day. You know, we all have bad days. But when is it clinical? I'm using that word very importantly, clinical depression. When do you need clinical help? When do you need to go to a mental health professional and see if you need an antidepressant? I'd like to bring in here the fact also, antidepressants are not addictive. So many people I've interviewed said literally that antidepressants save their lives. So don't be frightened. You can take it for, I don't know, Malcolm will know more than I do. I think generally it's about 6 months that you would stay on one. And as Nkini said, if you're given an antibiotic and told to, you know, you've got to take them for so many days, you must stay on that. You don't come off it. So, but you know, going back to your core question, why don't people go and see people? I think it's everything we've spoken about tonight. It goes back to what's been drummed into you from when you're small, you know, the mana, you've got to be strong. And that's really it.
Yeah. And you know, Casey, I just want to also add, I mean, when we talk, treatment, and really being on antidepressant or even, you need to look at it this way, that if you break your bone, right, you go and get plaster of Paris and you must keep it on. If it's my arm that's broken, I keep it on for whether it's 6 months or 9 months, depending on how severe my injury is. Because if you remove it too prematurely, you are not going to be healed, right? And this is how we need to look at, antidepressants, as an example, that they provide that plaster of Paris for your brain. For your brain to start, going back and remember, when you're depressed, obviously there's a chemical imbalance in your brain. So your happy chemicals like your serotonin and dopamine, they are insufficient. There's a deficiency of that. Now, antidepressants act as a plaster of Paris for your brain, allowing your brain to start, producing sufficient amounts of, those chemicals in your brain. And that really is what then helps, the physical symptoms and some of the physiological symptoms as well that manifest in your body. So it's important to really give enough time as instructed by your doctor, your psychiatrist, to say you need to be on this for 6 months or for a year, because that really is what's going to help your brain, to come back to producing those, sufficient amounts of those chemicals in your brain.
I love that analogy, Nkini, because I think we can all relate to a broken bone and plaster of Paris. And I think, again, we're so good at taking care of our physical body, but we forget that the brain is an organ. And I think what's so great about this conversation and sharing around symptoms and treatment is, and even through the book, Mariam, with interviewing all of these stories and these high-profile cases, is where it's these stories that help us to normalize treatment, normalize getting help, normalize even talking about it, having the big rugby man talk about his feelings and how he struggled and what helped, or the Olympian on how he really struggled. And I think we have to normalize those conversations. And I'm thinking having more men who are sharing those stories that other men can listen to as well. So I really love that thought. And Nkini, we have another question in the chat box around, us as responsible citizens. We are also responsible to try and identify people that are on the edge of taking their own lives or even struggling. Is there any guides on when such a person should reach out, how to help them quickly? So if you're seeing someone that is struggling, how do you start that conversation? I know you've done a lot of work in suicide prevention and depression and helping someone. But when you see that someone is struggling, how do we start that first step to get them help?
Yeah, absolutely. And Casey, I think, we earlier on we spoke briefly about the signs and symptoms. It is important that we all empower ourselves, with the signs and symptoms, what to look out for, to really, really also be very much aware of, some of those telltale signs when it comes to suicide. You have a loved one, you have a friend, you have a colleague that might be actually making certain utterances, that could potentially say to you, you know what, this person could be actually potentially, in trouble and really seeking out for help. Most people think that when somebody takes away their life, they actually don't say anything, or there are no telltale signs. And to the contrary, there are. I mean, we know that at least over 70%, of people that, have taken away or look to suicide as a solution, they have actually given, some signs. They'll often talk about, death, talk about, I wonder what it will be like when I'm no longer here, making those kind of preparations, and giving away some of the things that really, mattered to them, withdrawing, from activities that they previously, enjoyed taking part in. If it's a student, is a young person studying, we will see a change in their academic performance. But what is important is when you are empowered with that information and you are able to identify these telltale signs, is to engage with the person in a non-judgmental, manner, not talking down to say you've got this problem and therefore this is the solution. Really not being judgmental, providing, be supportive, allow the person to openly express, and rather suggest, how about, you speak to this, or here's, some information, that can help you. I mean, as the South African Depression Anxiety Group, on our on our website, I beg your pardon, we've got, a lot of information on the different types of mental health conditions, self-help tips, and really how to help a loved one as well, to just try and guide them in the right way, to seek proper, medical attention. So, oftentimes we think that, also if I engage with a loved one, if they start talking about death or start talking or giving, hints that they are looking to suicide, is to shut down that door and not have that conversation, and I mean, really, what we don't realize is that by engaging, in that, conversation, you are actually helping to prevent a potential, suicide. So don't shut it down. Listen attentively, be supportive, do not judge, and do not try to be the medical expert, but really just try and be there to guide, the person to the right path in terms of seeking help.
And I really love that, in like that guidance. And I think men, and we had a question as well, is like, how do you reach out to somebody, especially a man who doesn't think that anything is wrong with them? But I think what you've just mentioned now, that gentle approach, it's starting that conversation. It's talking again and again until they listen. And I think that can be, used for women and men, children and adolescents and elderly. It just talks to everyone, because this is often a topic that is taboo, that is scary to talk about. And just like you mentioned, we often want to shut it down. We also have an amazing, different complex audience that we have this evening. And we had a question on what role can social workers play in promoting mental health awareness and emotional expression in communities, especially where cultural beliefs discourage openness about mental health. And I just wanted to say as well to the social workers who are there on the grassroots, on the ground, pushing, they're doing such amazing work and such hard, complex work, but they're often the first place that we see changes in our community, the first place that could be a safe place for someone to start the conversation. So there's a lot of probably burden and a lot of responsibility that it comes with. But just any thoughts from your side, Nkini, on where our culture says, discouraging that openness, how do we challenge that head on?
Yeah, and yeah, it's a big challenge without a doubt, Casey. I mean, we have been raised to believe that, if somebody takes away their lives, they are not worthy, to be grieved. I mean, we've got, idioms or saying, your phrases in some of our language. Well, in fact, almost all our languages. I mean, in Sepedi, we say, so meaning that if loosely translated is that if that, you take away your life, you're not worthy of our tears. So therefore we are not going to grieve. It fuels this whole stigma and the taboo, associated, with suicide. So really it's important that, as parents, we start changing how we socialize our kids, how we raise our kids, and these kind of cultural beliefs that we hold. Do we continue teaching this and really challenging ourselves, to do better, to really drive the education and the awareness that suicide is a severe consequence of untreated mental health condition. So it's not really that the person, that has taken away their lives, they are selfish, they do not care about their families, they are weak, they are all of this. So really starting to challenge, these myths, that so, exist in our communities, education. And, when you're talking about social workers within our communities, they really play such a significant role. And Casey, as SEDEC, we go into communities, to really educate. And really, we speak to different, players within the communities, and certainly social workers are one of them. Our educators, even our traditional, healers, religious leaders, to really start saying, empower yourself with, the knowledge around mental health conditions, so that when you have, a community member, a member of your church, coming to you for help, that you at least are aware and can then be able to, direct them, to SEDEC or to their doctor or their nearest clinic and so forth. So social workers within communities, certainly, because we know that, access to mental health care in our communities, there is really a huge gap. So really they are bridging that gap and play a significant role, as you said, Casey, to educate and to really intervene, in most cases within the families. So absolutely, there is no doubt that, education, awareness, and really just, changing our approach and, our attitude, towards mental health condition, even our language, and, what we say, how we say, to our boy child, to our girl child, to really start making the change within our families. Charity begins at home, and let us then do better, to, try and turn the tide, so to speak.
I can't believe we've already been doing this for an hour, and I feel like we could do this for another 3 hours, because it talks around the importance, and I think more people are engaging, and I love seeing those questions come through. And I think as we're wrapping up, and this is just a series that we're going to be talking to, I know Swayze de Bruin, who really wanted to be here, was unable to attend due to an urgent team meeting. And we know, being South African, the rugby team comes first, but I know he really wants to share his story. So we will be reaching out. So please do follow us on our social media as we share his story, and that can help ignite more conversations and have more real voices out there. So please don't miss out on that. But Marion, I just wanted to come to you, and I know that as we're wrapping up, but we can always be talking more and more. There was a question around how can personal stories of pain and healing become a way to help others see that freedom is possible. And I think through all your books, you really do interview some amazing people, and you give such a voice to people that have kept their stories hidden and have been so vulnerable with you, and sharing that. And I think through those stories, whether you're a wife or someone, a brother or a cousin or a friend, reading it could be so helpful. how do we get more people to keep talking about mental health, and where to from here?
I think a lot of it goes back now, not goes back, is starting to change. I'm finding younger men. I have a son in his 30s, and I was quite surprised when he told me he goes to therapy because he's seems not someone that gets anxious. I mean, he's quite a laid back guy. All right, he is married to a clinical psychologist and his sister's a clinical psychologist, so maybe that played a role. But seriously, he says, no, there's nothing wrong. I just go and I find it really helpful once a month just to sit there and talk about whatever I want to talk to. And I think he's one of his generation. They are starting to see it differently. And you did ask me, though, about sharing. How do I get people to share stories? So I put the word out there, and then I hope this one's going to tell that one. And it is getting easier. It definitely is. I'm just starting my research for my next book, which is on women and mental health. And of course, the funny thing is, within days, and I think I said this to you, Cassie, that it took me months to get men to open up for me. Within days, women are ready to open up. But also things as a woman and as a mother I didn't know about. I'm dealing with women who've gone through the most horrendous times when they were pregnant and had babies, and the struggle today being young working mums. That's another whole area of mental health that we've never really looked at, because when you're a mother and today you're a working mother, you're expected to do it all, you know. And so that's another, but I'm finding that easier and easier. And I think with men too, I know that as we talk about it, and when people like rugby players and I have a Bafana former goalkeeper in the book, comedians, broadcasters, Alex J, people like that, you know, people see them on a pedestal. And when you get their stories and they're willing to speak, that helps break barriers.
Absolutely. And I think also, Marion, everyone should be reading this book, whether you have a son, a husband, a brother. There's so much that we can learn. And you know, especially speaking to the theme of what Nkini spoke to about our boy child, I think everyone should be reading this book because we're all impacted. We all have men around us, and we can all be part of that change.
I just want to say,
yes,
you know, with my books, they're not heavy tomes. They're not, oh, I'm going to be so depressed if I read this. I make them completely conversational. I let the people tell their stories. So don't think if you're going to buy this book, it's going to be heavy. And I don't think so. Most people say to me, oh, I read it in like one go. So I've got to push my book a bit there for my publishers.
Well, I think it's also really important as to, you know, having real South African stories in a book that we can access and read and we can relate to, because we've heard them on the radio, we've seen them on TV, we've seen them on the screens. How do we get a copy of the book, and where can we find it?
Okay, well, it's available, as they say, at all good bookshops, Exclusive Books and other major booksellers. I know it's online through Loot and someone else. If you go to my publishers, are called Bookstorm, to their website, but it's certainly available on the shelves in Exclusive Books. That I am absolutely positive about. And the title is Men and Mental Health, Shattering the Silence.
And I think that's exactly what we've done this evening. And I can also say to our panelists, just through you sharing and talking, we have had so many people who have joined us this evening who have reached out for help. And that already tells us that by having these conversations, we're already encouraging more people to seek help. And that's all that we can ask for. So just to everyone who's also in our chat box on our Zoom webinar and Facebook, who have been open and vulnerable and have taken that first step in being brave, thank you. And our counselors will reach out to you. I will be sharing all of SADAG's details at the end. As Nkini's mentioned, we have a website filled with resources. We have 24-hour helplines that provide free telephone counseling and referrals. We have over 200 support groups nationwide for free that you can connect to and find more safe spaces where you can feel comfortable to share your experience and just connect with other people who have been there, done that, got the t-shirt. But as we're wrapping up, yes, sorry, Marion.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Malcolm's going to be inundated with people wanting to come and work for Sun Pharma after they heard.
I think so.
Absolutely. And I have a couple of people in the chat box asking us to post the link for the book, which we will do now. So please look out, and we will be sending the recording as well as details for the book to everyone who's registered. So please look out for your emails tomorrow. I'm going to come to you, Malcolm, because having such a corporate and such a big supporter of mental health and the work that you're doing, and I think also more personally in sharing your own personal journey, what do you hope that having the book, having this conversation, what do you hope we see the change around men and mental health in South Africa?
Yeah, I think, the book and the stories are so relevant. I mean, like Marion has alluded to, I mean, here we've got people who are on pedestals who are prepared to share their stories. And I think what's important that, as ordinary citizens, we need to be brave and share our own stories as well. And as we share our stories, we find that people do open up. So I think the fact of being a good citizen and having a shoulder and an ear to listen to people is incredibly important, because the more people that open up, the more possibilities there are for people to get help. And I think what's critically important is 25, 30 years ago, certainly it was incredibly expensive to be able to be on antidepressants. The prices have come down tremendously, and it really is affordable to all South African citizens. So the reality is that there are opportunities out there to get the help that people need. They just need to be brave, pick up the phone a friend, or reach out, and they really can make their lives better. And I really encourage, whether it's men, whether it's women, or whether it's young teenagers who often, have the social media abuse which goes on in the background, to really reach out and understand that this can be beaten.
I think just bringing in again our adolescents and giving that hope that there is help available. It's just about taking that step. Malcolm, thank you again just for your bravery. And Nkini, I know we could talk for hours on this important topic. And I know that you're always so great at addressing that stigma and really connecting people to that help. And even though every day should be Mental Health Awareness Day, what are your hopes in having this conversation? Where do we need to see mental health and men in the next year?
Yeah, certainly, Casey, to really normalize, for men to come forward and seek help, for men to be proudly able to stand up and say, you know what, I am actually experiencing a psychological or emotional well-being. The challenges of life are never going to go away. We're never going to live in a world where it is stress-free. So I think it's important, for us men, and I would love to see this, that, we can acknowledge and accept that we are human, that we can potentially experience, these mental health, conditions, and really to just normalize. I mean, talking about going for therapy, Marion just said, even if you're really not potentially suffering from a mental health condition, but to just go and offload. I always like to make an example that, a sponge, when you use a sponge, to try and, wipe water off, it can only take in so much, right? You need to squeeze it out so that it can absorb more water, and even us as, as human beings, as men, more specifically, we can't keep taking all these life stresses and the challenges and the pressures that come without really, having an outlet to just offload and really be strong again and to be able to, to continue. So really my wish is that we normalize this. We normalize teaching our boy child that, they are just as, a human being, as their, girl sister or counterpart, and ready to start changing, our approach and challenging the myths that drive the stigma, within, our society when it comes to men and mental health.
What a great way to wrap up. Absolutely. And I think it gives us that motivation on where we need to focus next. Marion, I know we have had many conversations, and I know that it doesn't end tonight and with this book, but I think really your message to other men who are on tonight, what is your message of hope to them?
I think reach out. Don't be frightened to speak to your friends, to your partner, to your family. I think people would be surprised that when you do open up, people aren't going to be judgmental. Not today. There's too much happening out there. And as Nkini touched on, there's so many issues in society today and in the workplace. What you don't realize is you're going through something, but you know what? The guy that works next to you is probably going through exactly the same thing. Talk about it. Start conversations.
Absolutely. And I think without further ado, I think I just wanted to thank all of our panelists this evening for your time in helping us to have this conversation and for sharing and just being open to this discussion. I wanted to just share our contact details, which are not now showing. I think it's a start to many conversations, and I just wanted to thank each of our panelists for your time and expertise and your passion around this. It makes me really excited to create more safe spaces. And to everyone that's joined this evening, thank you for sharing. Thank you for your time. Please do feel free to pass this on to other people and share the messages that you've learned this evening. We will be sending the recording and the key helpline details to everyone after this session. And I think, again, there is no health without mental health. And I think as we go forward, please do reach out for help if you ever need to speak to someone or need to get care. And the numbers are just not showing at the moment, but I know we've posted it in the chat box. To everyone, thank you so much for your time. To our panelists, thank you for your time. And we look forward to having more conversations going forward. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Good evening. Bye.
Bye.